Late, when the whole stone house had gone dark, and only one lamp still burned in the second-floor study, Elias Corsaro sat on the edge of the leather chair with his black shirt folded over the armrest, and his back bare beneath that tired yellow light. 3 old scars ran down his right side like 3 pieces of punctuation, in a story no one in Buffalo was permitted to tell. Maren Vogel knelt on one knee against the rug, rubbed her palms together to warm them, and laid them on his shoulder, and he went rigid, the way a man does when something touches a wound that isn't on his skin. His hand closed around her wrist, fast and hard, the reflex of a man who has lived too long inside someone else's sights. She did not pull away. She did not give back an inch. She only leaned in, close enough to see his jaw lock, close enough to hear his breath stop halfway. "Let go of my wrist, Mr. Corsaro." He didn't. "Do you have any idea how long it's been since anyone stood this close to me?" "Yes." She looked straight into his eyes. "The whole city knows. That's why I'm here. Now let go, so I can do my job." His fingers opened, slowly. They said the Corsaro boss was nothing but a name these days, 4 years married, and never a child. A wife who died in Italy, and a whisper that had hardened into common knowledge, the way everyone knows Lake Erie in January will cut through you. They said the bullets last autumn had only finished something fate had settled long before. And Maren took the position in that house because not one hospital in western New York would return her calls anymore, and because her dead mother's medical bills were never going to pay themselves. She thought she had come only to change dressings, count a heartbeat, and disappear quietly out of this man's life. But some weeks later, on a night when a snowstorm took the power out across the district and she came downstairs looking for a flashlight, she found him alone before the fire with a glass he had not touched. "Sit down," he said, without taking his eyes off the flames. "There's something I've never told a living soul." And what he confessed that night shattered every rumor in Buffalo, and left her unable ever again to be the woman she had been. If this story reached you, please leave a like, a comment, share it with someone you think needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel to walk with us through the stories still to come. But to understand who the man sitting in the reading room that night truly was, one must go back to the winter before, to a dinner in the long dining room of the stone house, when Maren Vogel hadn't yet heard the name Corsaro. 7 men sat around a walnut table so long that those at opposite ends had to raise their voices to hear one another. On the table were beef stew, warm bread, 2 opened bottles of red wine, and a single candle burning among the bowls and plates, because the chandelier overhead had been out for 2 days, and no one had bothered to replace the bulb. Outside, the wind off Lake Erie struck the window frames in long, steady waves, like the breathing of some sleeping animal. The third man on the left, a thick-necked fellow named Petey Malloy with a booming laugh, was telling a story about his uncle and a fishing boat that had sunk near Dunkirk. Everyone at the table laughed along. One man slapped his hand against the wood. Another poured more wine. Petey was reaching the best part, the part where his uncle had to swim ashore in his wedding suit, when Elias Corsaro, seated at the head of the table and silent the entire evening, didn't lift his eyes from his plate. He cut a piece of meat, set it down, and asked in an ordinary voice, as though he were asking what time the train left. "That warehouse on Ohio Street. Who did you rent it to last month, Petey?" The laughter didn't stop all at once. It died one man at a time, like the lights along a city block going dark one after another, until nothing remained but the wind beyond the windows and the small crack of the candle. Petey Malloy kept the smile on his face for another moment, because his expression hadn't yet received the news from the rest of his body. No one looked at him. The man beside him lowered his eyes to his plate. The man across from him reached for the salt even though he didn't need any. "I don't understand what you mean," Petey said. Elias didn't answer. He finished the piece of meat on his plate slowly, without haste, as though dinner were the only matter in that room worthy of his attention. He took a sip of water. He placed his knife and fork down, side by side, perfectly straight. Then he lifted his napkin, wiped his mouth, folded it in half, and laid it beside his plate. Everyone at the table watched that napkin as though it were something about to explode. "Tomorrow morning, bring the keys here." Elias rose and pushed his chair back into place. "Both sets." He said nothing more. He hadn't looked at Petey once during the entire exchange. He walked around the head of the table, rested a hand on the shoulder of the man sitting closest to the door for a single second, a touch that was almost friendly, and then left the room. His footsteps faded along the stone corridor, slow and leaning slightly to one side, until they disappeared entirely. The 6 men remained seated around the table, and not one of them touched his food again. Petey Malloy placed both hands flat on the tabletop, perhaps to keep them from falling somewhere beyond his control. And in the yellow candlelight, the man beside him could see with perfect clarity that those hands were trembling. About a 40-minute drive from that stone house, along the southern edge of the city, there was a private emergency clinic tucked into an aging strip mall between a laundromat and a fishing supply store that had been closed since autumn. That night, Maren Vogel was on duty alone with a very young resident physician and a receptionist in her second year of college. Outside, the snow fell in wet clumps, the kind of snow that wasn't cold enough to be beautiful, only cold enough to make everything unpleasant. Near the end of the shift, the glass door flew open, and two men carried in a young man of about 21 or 22, his face drained white, his lips turning blue, his body limp between the arms holding him up. No identification, no insurance card, no name. The receptionist asked for the patient's name, and one of the men said only that the kid needed help immediately. Maren didn't ask again, because for the next 20 seconds, she no longer had time for questions of any kind. She pulled a stretcher into the treatment room, called out the blood pressure reading, started an intravenous line in the bend of his left arm on the first attempt, and began to work. The resident had been out of medical school for only 7 months. His hands were shaking, and there came a moment when he stopped in the middle of the room, unable to remember what came next. Maren read each step aloud to him in a steady voice that didn't rise even slightly, like someone giving directions to a driver who had lost his way. She worked for 40 minutes. Her hands didn't stop once, and they never moved any faster than necessary. Only when the numbers on the monitor finally settled where they needed to be did she remove her gloves. And by then the shirt beneath her scrubs was soaked all along her spine. The next morning, she was asked to come up to the 3rd floor. 3 members of the board were waiting in the room, along with a hospital attorney and a cup of coffee no one touched. They asked her what she had seen. Maren said she had seen a young man brought in critical condition. She explained what she had done and the order in which she had done it. She gave them his readings when he arrived and his readings when he left. They asked whether she knew who the 2 men were. She said she didn't. They asked whether she had heard what they said to each other in the hallway. She said she had been in the treatment room and the door had been closed. They asked the same thing again and again in 3 different ways, each time pressing a little farther to see whether she would add even 1 sentence more. And each time Maren told them exactly what she had seen, not 1 word less and not 1 word more. The attorney took notes. At the final question, one of the board members suggested that perhaps, so late at night and as tired as she must have been, she couldn't possibly remember everything with complete accuracy. Maren looked directly at him and said that she remembered exactly. Her termination letter was placed in her hands the next day, along with an envelope containing 1 month of severance pay, and beneath the reason for dismissal, someone had typed 2 words, organizational restructuring. She signed the receipt, returned her access card, folded her white coat, and placed it on the desk of the receptionist who was in her 2nd year of college. Then she walked out to the parking lot. Her car was parked in the farthest corner, a silver sedan made even paler by road salt, with a long crack across the rear window that had been there since autumn and had been patched with 2 layers of clear tape, now yellowed with age. She sat behind the wheel, placed both hands on it, and remained that way for a very long time, while snow slowly gathered across the windshield. She didn't cry. In her head, she calculated how much was still owed on her mother's hospital bills. Then she calculated the balance in her bank account. Then she calculated how far 1 month of severance pay might carry her. She had no idea that at that very moment, in a stone house on the northern side of the city, her name had just been written into a cloth-bound notebook, with 2 brief words beside it in the handwriting of a woman who hadn't trusted anyone in 34 years. 3 days later, someone knocked on her apartment door. Maren was standing in the kitchen, calculating how long 1 month of severance pay would last if she ate only 1 meal a day, and the sound startled her because no one had knocked on her door in a very long time. The woman standing in the hallway looked to be somewhere in her early 60s, with short silver hair, a gray wool coat buttoned all the way to her chin, and snow boots still crusted with salt at the toes. She didn't smile. She didn't look as though she expected to be invited inside, either. She simply stood there, holding a brown envelope between 2 wool-gloved hands, and looked Maren over from head to toe exactly once, with the assessing gaze of someone inspecting merchandise, not someone trying to find employment for another person. "You're Maren Vogel." It wasn't a question. "I'm Ruth Pryor. I manage the household for a family on the north side of the city. Marin remained in the narrow opening of the door and said that she didn't accept work through agencies, and that if this had anything to do with the hospital, she had already signed every document they had given her. Ruth Pryor didn't move. "I didn't ask whether you wanted the job," she said. "I asked how many days you have left before they take the car." Marin didn't answer. That number had lived inside her head for the past 3 days, and she hadn't spoken it aloud to anyone. Ruth Pryor raised the envelope. "Read what's inside. If you decide it won't work, burn it. I won't come back a second time." Inside the envelope was a typed sheet of paper with no heading, no company name, and no address. In the center of the page was the monthly salary, and Marin had to read it twice because it was 3 times more than anything she had ever been paid in her life. Beneath it were 3 short lines. "Live-in, room and board fully provided. Employment may be terminated at any time without cause. Who is the patient? You'll know when you arrive. You aren't going to tell me who I'll be caring for?" "No." Ruth Pryor tugged her gloves tighter. "You didn't ask the name of that young man the other night, either." Marin stood motionless in the doorway, the paper in her hand, a cold sensation traveling down her spine, not because of the draft in the hallway, but because she understood that this woman knew what had happened that night, and she had known before she ever reached this floor. "How long do I have to decide?" "I'll pick you up at first light tomorrow morning." Ruth Pryor had taken half a step away when she stopped. "One more thing. Don't thank me yet." She said it calmly, the way someone might mention that rain was coming, then walked down the stairs without looking back. The next morning, the 2 women traveled north along the road that followed the lake. The sky hung gray and low, and the water had begun to freeze into cloudy white sheets near the shore. Wind swept snow across the road in thin bands that looked like smoke. Ruth Pryor drove without turning on the radio, and during the entire 40-minute journey, she spoke exactly 3 sentences, all of them about the weather. The house appeared beyond a bend in the road, standing on a high rise of land overlooking the water. It was 3 stories tall, built of gray stone, with a steep roof covered in snow. Half the windows were sealed tight behind wooden shutters fastened from within. At either end stood 2 wings that clearly hadn't been entered in a long time, the snow before their doors lying smooth and untouched, without a single footprint. A small black camera was mounted at every corner of the roof. None of them blinked, and every one of them faced downward. 3 cars of the same color were parked in the courtyard, and one of them was running even though no one was inside. Ruth Pryor led her through a side entrance, along a cold stone corridor, and up a service staircase with a wooden banister worn smooth where countless hands had rested over the years. As she walked, she spoke in an even voice, neither fast nor slow, like someone reading train times at a station. "You aren't to write anything about his condition on paper. No notebook, no medical chart, no scraps of paper. Whatever you need to know, you keep in your head. You aren't to go into the basement, not once, not even to retrieve something, and you don't speak until you're asked a question. Not because he's difficult, because in this house, people who speak less tend to live longer." Marin set her bag down beside the bed in the small room at the end of the second-floor hallway. 4 nurses left within a winter and a half, Ruth Pryor said. Marin turned to look at her. "What did he do to them?" The woman stood in the doorway and remained silent so long that Marin thought she wasn't going to answer. "No," she finally said. "The city did. Those are 2 different things, and you should learn to tell them apart as soon as possible." On her first morning, Ruth Pryor led her into a small room beside the reading room on the 2nd floor and opened a built-in wooden cabinet, and Marin stood looking inside for nearly a minute without saying a word. It wasn't a household medicine cabinet. It was the supply room of a miniature surgical ward, arranged in straight rows and carefully labeled, stocked with intravenous antibiotics of the kind used only after ordinary ones had failed, along with drainage kits, sterile gauze, infusion tubing, and 3 vials of medication she knew for certain could be dispensed only by a licensed hospital. On the top shelf lay a stack of papers fastened together with a staple, not an official medical record, only handwritten lines from someone who had tried to reconstruct everything from memory. Marin read every page in 15 minutes, and by the time she set the papers down, she understood what they were paying her 3 times as much to do. The 3rd bullet, the one that had entered from the upper right side of his back, had left behind a fistula that refused to heal. It had been treated once, somewhere that wasn't a hospital, treated by someone skilled but without everything the work required, and ever since then, it had closed and opened again with the seasons, twice in the past 14 months. This man had developed a fever so high that someone had been forced to sit beside his bed through the entire night, and both times it had been what people in her profession called by a very short and very frightening name. At noon, she carried a tray of instruments into the reading room. He was seated at the desk with a stack of papers, and he didn't look up. Marin stood there for a moment, then spoke the first words she had said to the master of the house since entering it. "You're dying slowly from something an ordinary hospital could take care of in 3 days." He turned a page. "I know. You don't. If you knew, you would have gone already. You think I haven't considered it?" Only then did he look up. He seemed tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "You tell me, Miss Vogel. I spend 3 days in a room, with a number on the door, a name card hanging at the foot of the bed, 3 shifts changing over, and 20 people coming and going each day. How many people in this city do you think would know exactly where I was during those 3 days?" Marin couldn't answer. "I could get in," he said, turning back to the papers, "but I wouldn't get out." That afternoon, she worked in silence, changing the drain, taking measurements, storing every detail in her mind because she wasn't allowed to write anything down, and all through the day she kept thinking about the way he had spoken those final words, without bitterness, without complaint, but calmly, like a man reading tomorrow's weather forecast. That evening, she went down to the kitchen to eat with the household staff. 8 people sat around the long table. There was cornbread, a pot of potato soup, a small radio playing in the corner, and the warm, comforting atmosphere of a kitchen at the end of the day. Bridget Kearns, the young woman who tended the sitting rooms, propped her phone upright in the middle of the table and told everyone to watch this, because it was spreading all over the city. It was a short, edited video with background music and captions running beneath it, and it took an old remark someone had made on local radio and cut it into a joke about the man sitting upstairs. The punchline appeared at the 9th second. The whole table burst into laughter. Someone choked on their soup. Bridget played it again, and this time she mouthed the words along with it. Marin set her glass down on the table harder than she intended. "He paid every cent of your mother's radiation treatment." The laughter didn't stop all at once. It broke away in pieces, one person and then another, until only Bridget Kearns remained sitting there with the video still playing on her phone and color slowly rising from her neck into her face. "What does that have to do with anything? You told me yourself. On my 2nd day here, at this very table, you said his family paid for all of it and never sent you a bill." Marin heard her own voice, flat and cold, colder than she had ever heard it before. "So he pays for your mother's treatment and doesn't ask for a penny back. And you sit here mouthing along to a joke about what he can or can't do in the privacy of his own room, just to entertain people who would have let your mother die in the charity ward." No one said anything. The radio in the corner kept playing. "Eat," Ruth Pryor said from the far end of the table without looking up. Everyone ate. That night, Marin lay in the small room at the end of the hallway, listening to the wind search for a way through the cracks around the window, and tried to think of one decent reason for what she had done, but none came. She didn't know that man. She had been there only 9 days. She had just made an enemy of Bridget Kearns for the sake of someone who hadn't even known she existed the week before. "It must be pride," she told herself in the darkness. "You're only defending your own decision. You took the job here, and now you can't bear the thought that this place might be exactly what people say it is." It was a perfectly reasonable explanation, neat and complete, and she lay there listening to it echo through her mind for a long time before realizing that she didn't believe a single word of it. The cousin arrived without warning on a weekend afternoon, in a gleaming black car with a private driver, and the entire house had known he was coming 3 hours earlier, because Ruth Pryor had ordered Bridget to polish the first-floor hallway again. Cyrus Corsaro stepped out, wearing a soft gray wool coat and a silk scarf tied loosely at his neck, and he paused in the middle of the courtyard for a moment to look up at the front of the house, with the expression of a man studying a painting he was preparing to buy. He was about 41, with neatly combed hair, handsome in the polished way of men whose faces appeared on the covers of magazines sold in airports. He shook Marin's hand when they were introduced, and his hand was warm, dry, pleasant, and held hers half a second longer than necessary. That half second was so slight that if she had told anyone about it, they would have said she had imagined it. During afternoon tea, Cyrus Corsaro addressed every member of the household staff by name without making a single mistake. He asked Bridget about her mother. He asked the gardener about his knee. He even remembered the name of the head cook's dog, a dog that had died 2 summers earlier, and when the cook told him, Cyrus placed a hand over his chest and said he was deeply sorry, and he truly seemed to mean it. Then he turned to Marin. "Miss Vogel, I hear you worked in trauma emergency care." "Yes, before. Difficult work, endless night shifts." He stirred his tea. "And there's someone ill in your family as well, isn't there? Your mother." Marin set down her cup. "Yes, ovarian." Cyrus Corsaro said it gently, almost with sympathy. "That kind is usually advanced by the time they find it. I'm very sorry." No one in that house had ever asked Marin about her mother. She hadn't told Ruth Pryor. She hadn't told Bridget. She hadn't written it on any piece of paper there because she wasn't permitted to write anything down. Marin lifted her teacup, thanked him for his kind words, took a sip, and allowed the conversation to drift toward the weather because it was the only thing she could do in that moment. That night, she carried a tray of used instruments down the second-floor hallway. The middle of the corridor narrowed where the doors of 2 rooms faced each other, forcing anyone passing through to turn sideways, and Cyrus Corsaro was standing precisely there, holding a glass of water, as though he had stopped by chance. "Miss Vogel." He didn't move aside. When she turned sideways to pass him, he placed his other hand on her waist. Not forcefully, not tightly. He rested it there the way someone might lift a glass from a tray while passing a waiter, a gesture entirely casual, entirely natural, made by a man who had long been accustomed to never having to ask. "You're wasting your time here," he said. "My house in Amherst needs someone experienced as well. I wouldn't pay you any less, and you wouldn't have to carry trays up and down these stairs every day." Marin stood still. She thought of the money still owed. She thought of her younger brother on the south side of the city. She thought of what this man might write in a report and send to someone, and of who this entire house would one day belong to. All of those things stood with her in that narrow space between the 2 doors. "Take your hand off me." He smiled, and he didn't take his hand away. At the far end of the hallway, a door opened. Elias Corsaro came toward them. He didn't hurry. He didn't call anyone's name. He walked the full length of the corridor with that step that leaned slightly to one side, and the sound of his footsteps on the wooden floor was as steady as a clock. When he reached them, he stopped about 3 paces away and didn't say a word. He simply stood there and watched. The hand on Marin's waist disappeared so quickly it was almost comical. Cyrus Corsaro began to speak, and he spoke very fast, saying that he had been trying to find the stairs, that it had been so long since he had visited the house, that he had forgotten the way, that he couldn't remember which wing the guest rooms were in, and he continued without pausing for nearly 15 seconds. "The stairs are behind you," Elias said. Cyrus Corsaro left. The sound of his shoes descended the final step and vanished, and in the hallway there remained only a tray of instruments, a wall lamp, and 2 people standing 3 paces apart. Only after it was over did her hands begin to shake, and Marin found that absurd, because when steadiness had been required, her hands had given her all of it, and now, when there was nothing left to do, the instruments on the tray kept giving off a faint metallic clatter. She pressed it more tightly against her hip. Elias Corsaro noticed, and he said nothing about it, and Marin was more grateful to him for that than for anything he had just done in the hallway. "He'll leave tomorrow morning," he said, "before breakfast." "Sir," she cleared her throat. "He writes reports for someone. If you send him away now, he'll write about this too, and he'll write it in his own way." She lifted the tray a little higher. "Don't do anything. Not because of me. I can stay out of his way. There are only 4 days left." And this was the part she would still find herself thinking about many weeks later. He didn't tell her she was being foolish. He didn't say, "Let me handle this," the sentence that, in her experience, men usually spoke just before doing exactly what they had already decided to do. He stood there 3 paces away, his hands resting at his sides, and spoke in that rough voice he seldom used. "It happened to you, not to me." Marin looked at him. "I mean it," he said. "You tell me what you want me to do, and I'll do exactly that, and nothing more. You want him gone tonight. He'll be gone tonight, and anyone who wants to write something can write whatever they please. You want to leave it alone? I'll leave it alone. And for as long as he remains under this roof, you won't walk through a single hallway by yourself. Either choice is equally easy for me. I'm simply not going to choose for you." The hallway was very still. Somewhere on the floor below, a pot struck the side of a sink. 27 years, and no one had ever asked her that question. Her father hadn't asked. The men who came to collect her younger brother's debts certainly hadn't asked. The hospital hadn't asked. either. They had simply handed her a document already typed and ready to sign. The world put its hands on people first, then informed them afterward what had just been decided. "Tonight," Marin said. Cyrus Corsaro left the house in less than an hour, and no one in the kitchen knew why. 4 days later, Marin was passing the reading room with a stack of clean towels in her arms when she saw that the door stood open by about a hand's width. She hadn't intended to stop. She stopped because she heard a stranger speaking about the southern harbor, about a strip of waterfront property, and about a factory owner named Halbert, who controlled 2 parcels lying directly across the middle and refused to sell to anyone. "He's very stubborn, sir. He says it was his father's factory." "He has a family," another voice said. A woman's voice, perhaps the bookkeeper. "A wife and 3 children. The oldest is at Syracuse." Then came Elias's voice, low and calm, no faster and no slower than the way he said anything else. "I know. I've given him 3 chances already. 3 offers, 3 prices, each one higher than the last. No one can say I didn't give him a choice." There was the sound of paper turning. "Then we proceed, sir?" Marin didn't hear the answer because someone was coming up the stairs behind her, and she had to keep walking. 9 days later, the local newspaper carried a brief item on the business page. Mr. Halbert had sold his entire ownership stake in the machine shop, bearing his family's name to an unnamed group of investors, and he and his family had moved to Florida. From the moment the workers were informed to the moment the moving truck left the city, 4 days had passed. No one was hurt. There were no police, no lawsuits, and not a single line suggesting that anything unusual had happened. There was only a 60-year-old man who had held on to his father's factory for his entire life, and then, within 4 days, no longer held it at all. Marin read the article at the kitchen table, folded the newspaper, and carried the medication tray upstairs as she did every afternoon. He was standing with his back to the door, looking down at the white expanse of the lake through the window, and he spoke without turning around. "You heard." "Yes." "How long were you standing outside the door that day?" "Maybe half a minute." He nodded, still looking through the window. "Do you want me to lie to you?" Marin set the tray on the table. She thought of the 3 children, and of the one studying at Syracuse. She thought of the trembling hands on the dining table that night, hands she herself had never seen. She thought of a man standing 3 paces away from her in a hallway, asking what she wanted. "No," she said. "Good." He turned around and began unfastening the buttons at his cuffs so she could work. "I wasn't planning to." It happened on a night near the end of the month, long after midnight, when the entire house was asleep, and Marin woke to the sound of a car braking hard on the gravel outside. She sat up in the darkness and listened. Car doors slammed, 3 in quick succession, followed by the sound of several pairs of feet hurrying through the stone hallway below, and someone spoke a short sentence in a voice that had gone unsteady. She pulled a coat over her nightclothes, slipped her feet into her shoes, and reached the kitchen before anyone had time to come upstairs for her. There were 4 men in the kitchen. 3 were standing, and one was seated on a wooden chair beside the sink. The seated man was Rourke Fallon, a man of about 50, with the shoulders of someone who had worked outdoors all his life. His right arm was wrapped in 3 layers of kitchen towels that had already turned dark, and someone was holding it raised above him. His face was bloodless, and he was trying to smile at the man beside him, the kind of smile people wear when they're trying to convince themselves that things haven't become too serious yet. "The hospital," Marin said. "We can't," the man closest to the door answered. "Then call an ambulance." Miss Vogel. Ruth Pryor had appeared in the doorway without Marin noticing, her hair tied back in haste and a sweater pulled over her clothes. "An ambulance here means the police. The police here means 3 of the men in this kitchen won't make it home tomorrow. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Marin looked around the kitchen once. The overhead light was yellow and weak. The long dining table stood against the wall, and the bread tray from dinner was still sitting untouched on its surface. There was a large sink, running hot water, and soap. It took her about 3 seconds. "Put the tray down," she said. "Pull the table into the middle of the room. The overhead light isn't enough. I need a handheld lamp aimed exactly where I tell you. Someone go to the cabinet in the room beside the second-floor reading room and bring down everything from the 2nd and 3rd shelves, boxes and trays alike. Don't choose. Bring all of it. Boil a pot of water. And the 2 of you standing in the path I need to use. Move to the other side of the kitchen." The 2 men were nearly twice her size. They moved. She washed her hands beneath the hot water until her skin turned red, pulled on gloves, and began. Whenever she said what she needed, she spoke in a steady voice that never rose, and everyone in the kitchen obeyed without asking a single question. Elias Corsaro came downstairs just as she finished clearing the surface of the table. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't ask who had done it. He took the handheld lamp from the man holding it, walked around the table, stood exactly where Marin pointed, and aimed the beam downward. Then he remained perfectly still for 40 minutes. He didn't speak once during those 40 minutes. Each time she tilted her head, the beam shifted with her before she even had time to open her mouth. That light didn't tremble once. Not once. Not even halfway through, when Rourke Fallon clenched his teeth and the entire kitchen became so quiet that the sound of water boiling in the pot could be heard clearly. Marin worked. Her hands were steady. Her fingers went exactly where they needed to go, and there was nothing in her mind except what lay beneath them. At one point, she had to stop, change direction, and begin one step again from the start, and no one in the room made a sound as they breathed. Then the next step worked, and the step after that worked as well. And at last she lowered herself into a chair, removed her gloves, and realized that the clothing along her spine was soaked through, just as it had been on her final night in that emergency room. Ruth Pryor poured her a glass of water, and Marin drank it all in one breath. Rourke Fallon had fallen asleep on the table, his arms secured and a blanket spread across his chest. The other 3 men stood in the corner of the kitchen, and none of them seemed to know what to do with their hands. Elias Corsaro switched off the lamp and placed it on the counter. Marin looked up at him, and she spoke the only words she said to him throughout that entire night. "Next time, take him to a hospital," she said. "I saved the arm. I can't save the whole man." On Saturday morning of that week, Marin went out to the courtyard to leave for her volunteer shift at the clinic down in Black Rock, and she had made it halfway to the parking area when she stopped. The rear window of her silver sedan was no longer held together by 2 yellowing layers of tape. There was a new pane of glass in its place, clean and perfectly clear, and she could see the entire back courtyard through it. She walked once around the car the way someone might circle an unfamiliar animal. All 4 tires were new, genuine winter tires with deep tread, still covered in the tiny rubber hairs left behind by the factory. The windshield washer reservoir was filled to the cap. Both windshield wipers had been replaced. There was no invoice tucked beneath either blade. There was no card. She opened the car door, and on the driver's seat lay a piece of ordinary white paper folded in half, torn from some kind of notebook. Inside was only one line, written in ink in a hard, slanting hand, the handwriting of a man accustomed to writing short sentences that no one was permitted to misunderstand. "The road along the lake stays frozen until April." Marin sat down behind the wheel. She placed both hands on it and remained there for a very long time inside the freezing car, her breath gathering into a pale mist across the new glass. She had mentioned that road exactly once, on her first day, while Ruth Pryor was driving her up to the house, and she had spoken to the person sitting beside her, not to anyone else. She hadn't thought anyone was listening. She had driven this car through 4 winters with a cracked rear window, and every time she reached that curve along the road, she slowed down and tightened her grip on the wheel a little more, and she had never told anyone because it wasn't the sort of thing people told. She didn't start the engine. She remained there until her hands began to ache from the cold, then folded the note into quarters and slipped it into the inside pocket of her coat. That afternoon, when she returned, Ruth Pryor was sitting at the kitchen table with her cloth-bound ledger and a pencil, adding up the week's expenses. Marin poured herself a cup of tea and sat at the opposite end of the table. "He doesn't wear a ring," she said, not quite directing the words to anyone. "No watch, no chain, not even a bracelet. I've worked around enough wealthy men. I've never met one like that." Ruth Pryor didn't look up from the ledger. She finished adding one column, drew a line beneath it, and only then spoke. "When he was 9 years old, his father gave him a watch, gold, leather band, black face. He fastened it around the boy's wrist at this very table and told him, 'This is what proves you belong to the Corsaro family.'" She touched the tip of the pencil to her tongue. "He wore that watch for 8 years. Never took it off. Not even when he went swimming. Then, when he was 17, he carried it into a pawn shop on Niagara Avenue and sold it." Marin set down her teacup. A man had died because of an order his father gave the week before. The man left behind a wife and children. He took a bus all the way down there, knocked on the door, handed the woman every dollar he had received, and left without telling her who he was. Ruth continued, adding the next column. "From that day on, He never wore anything on his body again. Not one thing. His father bought him 2 more watches after that. He accepted them, put them in a drawer, and both of them are still lying in that drawer today. Ruth Pryor drew a line beneath the final column and closed the ledger. You asked me, so I told you. But don't ask him. The next morning, Bridget Kearns went up to the reading room to light the fire as she did every day, and found the hearth dark, the ashes completely cold, and the room empty and chilled. She stood in the doorway for a long time with an armful of firewood, because in the 4 years she had worked there, this had never happened once. By the middle of the morning, everyone in the kitchen knew. Ruth Pryor heard the news, set down her teacup, climbed to the 2nd floor by the main staircase instead of the service stairs, and came back down about 5 minutes later. She said nothing. She poured herself some tea, drank half the cup, set it down, and only then looked around at the 7 people seated at the kitchen table. Bridget, from today on, you'll take care of the reading room, she said. And every one of you, whether you're in this kitchen, at the market, in church, or standing in your mother's kitchen, will not speak a single word about anything you hear or don't hear in this house. From this day until the end of your lives. Someone started to open their mouth. Ruth Pryor didn't allow it. I've worked for that man since he was 9 years old. 34 years. For the past 4 years, I've watched him move through this house like someone who was buried long ago, and no one had gotten around to telling him. This morning, I came down to the kitchen and found him standing by the coffee pot, pouring himself a cup. She lifted her tea. Then he asked me what kind of bread we had today. No one said anything after that. So whoever ruins this, Ruth Pryor said, answers to me. In early March, on one of those rare, clear afternoons, Elias took Marin up to the rocky rise above the house, where the high ground reached out over the water. Lake Erie stretched beneath them, white and fractured. Sheets of ice piled against one another near the shore in broken ridges, and farther out, where the water still moved, the lake was black and steaming beneath the cold sunlight. The wind was so strong up there that they had to raise their voices. He didn't kneel. He simply stood facing her with his hands in his pockets, and spoke the words as calmly as he spoke everything else. And then he waited. Marin looked down at the lake for a while. No, she said. He took it better than she had expected, which meant he stood perfectly still and stared down toward the valley for nearly a minute. Tell me why, he said. Don't give me the decent reason. Give me the real one. There are several 100,000 people down there who have never met me once. She brushed her hair away from her face. The day you put a ring on your nurse's finger, this entire city will have the story ready before dinner. The Corsaro boss has been broken for 4 years. Then some little woman, buried in debt, crawled through the door and found a way to cure him. And what did she get for it? The house, the name, and everything you can see from here. I don't care what people say. I know, you haven't cared for 4 years. She turned to look at him. And look what it has cost you. 4 nurses left in a winter and a half. Your cousin put his hand on me in the hallway of your own house, in the middle of the night, under your own roof. Because once an entire city decides that a man is worthless, people begin to believe they have the right to take whatever they want from his home. I'm not walking into that, not while it's still standing there untouched. It may stand there forever. Maybe it won't. He was silent for a long time. The wind swept across the rocks, carrying the smell of ice and the damp earth hidden beneath the snow. And far below them, a bird crossed the white surface of the lake, a single black mark against all that emptiness. You frighten me a little, he said. Good, Marin said. It began with something so small that Marin hadn't given it a second thought in 4 months. Every Saturday morning, on her way down to the volunteer clinic in Black Rock, she passed a row of old storefronts along Grant Avenue, and in the middle of that row stood a glass-fronted space with the faded sign of an old tailor shop. She passed it 17 times. 17 times. The door was locked, the lights were off, and the snow before the steps held not a single footprint. It wasn't abandoned, because the glass remained clean, and someone still emptied the mailbox. It simply never opened. She thought about it while driving home. Then she thought about it while washing her hands, and that evening, she asked permission to look through the family's property records. Elias shrugged and told her she would be bored within a week. She wasn't. Within 3 nights, she found it. The storefront was held under a long-term lease by one of the family's companies, with the rent paid regularly each month into the landlord's account, and the landlord named on the agreement was Camille Ferrante, the dead wife's older sister. The original rent had been $4,000 a month for a place no one ever entered. Then it rose to $9,000. Then it rose to $15,000. Marin took a blank sheet of paper, drew 2 columns, and began matching the pieces. In the left column were the 3 rent increases. In the right were the things Ruth Pryor remembered, because that woman had kept the house's visitor logs and telephone records for 34 years, and she remembered the exact week the calls began, the week the second nurse's mother called, and the week the old story was being dragged out and retold most loudly across the city. The first increase came 5 days after the first wave. The second came 9 days later. The third came 6 days after that. She carried the paper into the reading room, placed it before him, and stood there with the feeling of someone who had just caught a thief inside her own home. Elias Corsaro looked at the page for a very long time. He didn't seem surprised. He wasn't particularly skilled at pretending. He read both columns from top to bottom, then read them again, and finally placed one finger in the middle of the page. "Half of that money is mine." Marin didn't understand. "Get your coat," he said. "Tomorrow morning, I'm taking you somewhere." They drove east for a little more than an hour, out of Buffalo, along the road running beside the lake, until they reached Rochester. He didn't speak during the drive, and she didn't ask. At last, he turned into a quiet neighborhood lined with 2-story wooden houses, painted in pale colors, and he parked at the end of the street, about 100 feet from a small house with a white fence, then shut off the engine. Sunlight lay across the front yard. Most of the snow had melted, leaving only a few streaks clinging to the base of the fence, and the wet grass shone beneath the light. A little girl of about 4, wearing a red coat and holding a cookie in one hand, stood in the middle of the yard, trying to teach the neighbor's dog to sit. The dog didn't sit. It spun in circles, jumped up, raced around the girl, then came back again. And she kept repeating the same word with the grave concentration of someone performing a very important task. Each time the dog failed, she laughed so hard she had to bend forward at the waist. Her laughter carried all the way to the parked car. A young woman sat on the porch steps with a cup of coffee in her hand, watching the yard and laughing too. "Sylvie was pregnant when she went to Italy," Elias said, his eyes fixed straight ahead. "No one knew. She died in an accident, not because of the pregnancy, and the baby survived." Marin couldn't speak. "She isn't mine," he said. "You already worked that out, but she isn't Cyrus's either, in case that's what you're thinking. Her father is a music teacher here, a man who teaches piano to children at a private school, a decent and completely ordinary man, and he has no idea he has a daughter. Sylvie never told him. She never told anyone." He tapped 2 fingers lightly against the steering wheel. Camille knew. She disappeared for exactly 9 months, and when she came back, the entire city believed the child was hers. She needed money to raise the girl, and she needed money to keep people from asking questions. Cyrus learned the truth and used it, exactly as you figured out, except half the money in your left column came from me. I've been paying from the first day. I paid through Camille because if I sent it directly, people would have asked why. In the yard, the dog finally sat, and the little girl cried out in triumph and wrapped her arms around its neck while the woman on the steps applauded. "For 4 years, Marin said very softly, "you've been supporting the child of the woman who destroyed your life." "The girl didn't do anything," he said. "She's only alive." Then he started the engine. "She's doing well. Someone is raising her properly. She has a yard, and the dog next door doesn't listen to anyone. My responsibility is to keep things that way, and to make sure she never has to learn a single word of any of this." He turned the car around at the end of the street, and they drove back. Throughout the journey to Buffalo, Marin sat silently looking through the window, thinking about the sheet of paper with 2 columns folded inside her coat pocket. And for the first time since she had entered that stone house, she realized that she had misunderstood the man sitting beside her, and that she hadn't misunderstood him by a little, but by a great deal. At the end of that month, Ruth Pryor asked whether she would take on another assignment, 2 visits a week in Amherst, and she gave Marin the patient's name before Marin had time to ask. Salvatore Ferrante, Sylvie's father, 78 years old, in the final stage of heart failure, confined to the first floor of a red brick house, with a wide porch and an old maple tree in the yard. 3 nurses had been hired in 4 months, and none of them had lasted because the old man often became confused at night and called out the names of people who were dead. Marin accepted. She didn't tell anyone why. The house was quiet and clean, and it smelled of medicine mingled with old wood. 7 or 8 framed photographs stood on the mantel, and among them was Sylvie Ferrante's wedding portrait, a beautiful young woman standing beneath an arch of flowers, with the smile of someone who knew beyond doubt that she was beautiful. The old man's bed had been placed beside the window so he could look out at the maple tree. On his lucid days, he told stories about his father's bakery on Hertel Street, about learning the electrician's trade, about the wife who had died 11 years earlier, and the way she used to sing in the kitchen. He called Marin the brown-haired girl. He thanked her every time she took his blood pressure, every single time, as though she had granted him some enormous kindness. Then one afternoon, when the light had turned golden and the shadow of the maple tree stretched all the way to the foot of his bed, he looked at her and no longer recognized her. "Is that you?" he said. Marin sat down in the chair beside the bed and didn't correct him. "It's your father," he said. "I heard everything. I heard a long time ago, sweetheart. People called me. 3 times. He breathed heavily for a while. "I didn't tell anyone. I didn't tell your mother. I kept waiting for you to stop on your own." He raised one hand and searched for hers in the air, and Marin allowed him to take it. "You told me you were suffering. I believed you. I believed you because I'm your father. But sweetheart, that family welcomed you into their home. They treated you kindly, and you kept going." His fingers tightened around hers, weak and trembling. "I begged you. I remember begging you. I sat in the kitchen downstairs and begged you, and you told me I was old and didn't understand anything." Outside, a car passed and faded into the distance. "You didn't stop," he said. "You didn't stop, and then you left, and I'm the one still alive." Marin said nothing. She sat quietly with her hand resting inside the old man's, listening to the clock on the wall in the next room mark each passing second. After a while, he released a long breath and returned to himself. He looked at her, and this time he recognized who she was. He showed no sign that he remembered anything he had just said. "Brown-haired girl," he said, "would you give me a sip of water?" She poured the water, helped him sit up, and he drank in small sips. When she set the glass down, he held onto her wrist. "You work for that house up there?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "That boy," he said, "calls me every month. He hasn't missed a single month in 14 years. He pays for this bed, the medicine, and for you too. I know that. I'm not confused. He never mentions any of it, and I don't ask." His hand tightened slightly. "My daughter is gone, miss. That much I know. But she was my child, and that's all I have left of her." Marin looked down at the hand holding her wrist, at the large knuckles and skin as thin as paper. "So if you happen to hear anything," the old man said, "don't tell the boy. He's been too good to me." The following Saturday, Rourke Fallon came to the volunteer clinic in Black Rock. Marin saw him when she stepped out to call the next patient number, and she assumed he had come so she could examine his arm again, because it was time to check it. But he didn't take a number. He sat in the row of waiting chairs against the wall, the faded orange plastic ones, with both hands resting on his knees and his wool cap still on his head. And he remained there for 2 full hours. People came in and went out. An elderly woman there for her joints sat beside him and talked for 20 minutes. And he nodded in the right places but didn't say anything. A little boy ran past and dropped his paper hat, and Rourke bent down, picked it up, and handed it back. When the clinic had nearly emptied, and Marin went to the reception desk to put away the paperwork, he stood. He walked over, stopped on the other side of the counter, and didn't look her in the eye. He took something from his coat pocket and placed it on the surface, keeping one finger pressed against it for another second before drawing his hand away. It was a small steel key, the kind used for a padlock, with a scratched yellow plastic tag attached to it and a stamped number pressed into the surface. "Just keep it," he said. Marin picked up the key. "What does this open?" Rourke Fallon had already turned away. He walked to the door, paused for a moment on the entrance mat, then pushed it open and stepped into the gray afternoon. She watched him through the glass until he turned at the corner and disappeared. It took her 4 days. The number on the yellow tag belonged to a self-storage facility on the southern side of the city, close to the highway. A row of low, corrugated metal buildings painted a faded green, each with a numbered rolling door. The attendant was a young man wearing headphones who didn't bother to look up. Unit 72 had been rented in cash, paid 1 year in advance, and the name on the paperwork didn't belong to anyone real. Marin stood before the rolling door for a long time with the key in her hand, and she didn't open it. She drove home, slept on it for one night, and the next morning she went looking for Rourke Fallon. He lived in a ground-floor apartment in Lackawanna, behind a tire repair shop. He opened the door, saw her, and showed no surprise at all, but he didn't invite her inside. He stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind him. "Unit 72, Marin said. "I didn't open it. I want you to tell me what's inside first." Rourke Fallon looked out over the parking lot filled with puddles. His right arm was still in a brace, and he held it with his other hand the way people hold something that no longer entirely belongs to them. "Do you remember that night in the kitchen?" he asked. "Yes. You worked for 40 minutes. You didn't ask me a single question." He kept looking toward the parking lot. "You didn't ask how I got hurt. You didn't ask what kind of work I did. You didn't ask whether I had a wife or children. You just did what needed to be done, and then you told them to take me to a hospital next time." He paused. "I worked for that house for 11 years. No one ever treated me that way before." Marin waited. "There are some boxes in there," he said. "Documents, recordings, the kind of things people hide away to protect themselves, you understand. I kept them because I was afraid. I've had them for 4 years, and I've never had the courage to do anything with them." "Who gave them to you?" "No one gave me anything." Only then did he look at her, and his eyes were red and tired. "Listen carefully, Miss Vogel. I didn't tell you anything. I didn't give you anything. You found it on your own, traced the storage place on your own, and opened it with a key you picked up somewhere. If anything happens later, I need you to remember those exact words for me." He opened the door and stepped inside. "Mr. Fallon," he stopped with half his body in the darkness of the apartment. "Why did you give it to me?" Rourke Fallon remained that way for several seconds. "I haven't slept through a decent night in 4 years, he said. And then he closed the door. They entered storage unit 72 early one morning, while the facility was still deserted, and inside there were only 3 plastic bins stacked one on top of another, a folding chair, and the dry smell of dust in a place no one had entered for a very long time. Elias pulled the rolling door down behind them and switched on the light hanging from the ceiling. Marin opened the first bin. They sat on the concrete floor for nearly 4 hours. Inside were bank statements, vehicle rental agreements, payroll records from a transportation company whose name had never appeared anywhere in the family accounts, and at the bottom of the second bin were 2 old phones with dead batteries and a handheld recorder with a memory card. Rourke Fallon had been in charge of the warehouses. He had the authority to sign for deliveries and issue access cards. And for the past 4 years, he had quietly kept copies of everything that passed through his hands. Marin arranged the papers across the floor in rows according to date, the same way she had always organized her mother's hospital bills. When she finished the 3rd row, she leaned back and looked at it, and she saw everything. "He didn't hire anyone to kill you," she said. Elias said nothing. "Look here." She placed one finger on the first document. 3 men were paid, half before the job, half afterward, and the second payment was much smaller than the first. No one pays that way for something like this. That's how someone pays for a job that was completed exactly as ordered. She moved to the next page. "And this is the schedule. That restaurant closed at 11 o'clock. You walked out close to midnight, into a parking lot with 6 lights, and 3 armed men were standing less than 50 feet from you." She looked up. "If they had wanted you dead, you would have died that night. It wouldn't have been difficult. It would have been the easiest thing in the world." Elias remained still, both arms resting on his knees. "If you died, that seat would be left empty," Marin said. "And when a seat like that is empty, 4 or 5 families all move at once, and Cyrus Corsaro can't be certain he'll win. He didn't want a war. He wanted the position handed back to him. He wanted 5 old men sitting in a room to nod their approval, quietly and properly, according to your rules." She pushed the paper toward him. "So he didn't hire men to kill you. He hired them to weaken you, to leave behind a man who walked with a limp, a wound that wouldn't heal, and weeks of fever that the whole city heard about. Then he let the story people were already telling about you finish the rest." She spoke the final sentence very softly. "He didn't need you dead. He needed you to become exactly that story." Elias picked up the paper. He read it for a very long time, far longer than it took to read the words written there. Then he put it down and reached for a document in the 3rd row, the payroll sheet from the transportation company, and he stared at a name on the 9th line without moving. "What is it?" Marin asked. He didn't answer. He stood, raised the rolling door, walked outside, and sat on the concrete step in front of the unit. Morning had fully broken. Behind the rows of metal buildings, trucks moved along the highway, their sound steady and distant. Marin followed him outside and stopped a few steps away. He sat there with his elbows on his knees and said nothing for a very long time. After that night in the parking lot, he finally said, "We searched. 3 weeks. We found a name." He looked down at the concrete between his feet. "They brought me proof. Money transferred into an account on the right day. His car parked 2 blocks away that night. Someone had seen him. Everything matched." "Did you ask him?" "Yes. He said he didn't do it," Elias said. "Everyone says that." Marin said nothing. "The name on the 9th line," he said, "belongs to the person who transferred that money into the account. He works for Cyrus's transportation company. The money was sent 4 days before the night in the parking lot." He spoke in a perfectly ordinary voice. "He left it there for us to find. He knew we would search. He prepared a man for us in advance." A car turned into the storage facility, rolled slowly past them, then disappeared into the next row. "Did he have a family?" Marin asked. Elias didn't turn around. "There's a woman in Cheektowaga who works 2 shifts a day now," he said. "She has 2 children still in school." He remained on that step for a long time after that, and Marin stood there with him and didn't say a word, because she understood that no words could possibly be right. And anything she said in that moment would only be a way of making herself feel better. Wesley Vogel came to the gate late one night near the end of March, after walking up from the bus stop through the cold rain, and the gatekeeper called the house to say that a young man was outside claiming to be Miss Vogel's younger brother. Marin went down to open the door and found him standing beneath the porch light, 24 years old, his hair plastered wet against his head, the hood of his sweatshirt pulled up, trying to smile at her the way he had smiled since he was 7 whenever he broke something in the house. "Don't make a big deal out of this," he said. She brought him into the kitchen and turned on every light. She fetched clean towels, a basin of warm water, and the instrument box she kept on top of the cabinet, then told him to sit in the chair and remove his coat. He couldn't manage it with his right hand, so she helped him. She washed her hands, put on gloves, and worked for 40 minutes without speaking, except when something needed to be said. She told him to breathe out. She told him to count backward from 10. The ring finger and middle finger of his right hand had been dislocated, and she set them back into place, one at a time, slowly and firmly, while Wesley drew air through his clenched teeth, but didn't cry out. She cleaned the split in his lip, closed it, checked his pupils, then examined his ribs by pressing each place in turn and asking where it hurt, and she stored every detail in her mind, because in that house, she wasn't permitted to write anything down. Her hands remained steady from beginning to end. When she was finished, she made him a cup of warm milk, prepared the bed in the small room at the end of the hallway, and sat beside him until his breathing became even. Then she stepped into the corridor, leaned her back against the wall, and cried silently for about 2 minutes. Afterward, she wiped her face and went down to the kitchen to retrieve her brother's phone from the pocket of the coat, hanging over the back of the chair. There were several messages on it. Wesley's debt had been purchased. All of it, gathered into a single package by a third party through an attorney downtown. The new creditor wasn't demanding immediate payment. The new creditor wasn't pressing him at all. The new creditor wanted only one thing, and Wesley had typed it in a message to his sister 3 days earlier, without understanding what he held in his hands. They said all you have to do is sign a notarized statement explaining how things between you and him began. Marin, I don't see how that could hurt anyone. You'd only be telling the truth. Marin stood in the kitchen for a long time with the phone in her hand, then went upstairs. Elias was in the reading room. She gave him the phone, and he read the messages, and she saw his jaw tighten before he read them a second time. Then he placed the phone on the desk, stood, and walked into the hallway. He took his coat from the hook. Marin followed him, reached the top of the stairs before he did, and stood across the passage with both arms at her sides. Move. What are you going to do? Go back to your room. I asked what you're going to do. And he shouted. One sentence, very short and very loud, the kind of sound the entire stone house heard, and somewhere below them, a kitchen door closed very softly. He didn't step toward her. He didn't touch her. He remained exactly where he stood, 3 paces away, his coat draped over one arm, while the echo of his voice lingered in the hallway for one more beat before fading. Marin didn't step back. Her hands were trembling, and she let them tremble, and she stayed where she was. There, she said, Her voice was far quieter than his. "That's exactly what they've always said about you." He didn't answer. "For 4 years, this entire city has been telling a story about you, and you've let them tell it. And you've endured it because of an old man in Amherst and a little girl in Rochester." She looked directly at him. "And tonight you were about to walk through that door and do exactly what they've been waiting for you to do. Why do you think he had my brother beaten? He had him beaten so you would walk out that door. That was the entire purpose of it." Her final words were softer still. "My brother is asleep in the room at the end of that hallway. I just set 2 of his fingers back into place. If you leave tonight, then tomorrow morning I'll have to explain to him that he caused whatever happens next." The hallway fell silent. Rain tapped against the windows. Elias Corsaro stood there for a very long time, and Marin didn't take her eyes off him for a single second. Then he turned, hung the coat back on its hook, and walked up the stairs without saying another word. The final storm of that winter swept in from the lake on the very night Marin was on duty in Amherst. The wind changed direction at dusk. The snow began falling sideways instead of down, and by late evening the local radio announced that the Lakeside Road and 3 interstate routes to the north had been closed. Elias drove down to pick her up and became stranded there, and he was sitting in the kitchen drinking coffee with the Ferrante housekeeper when Marin called his name from the sitting room in a voice he had never heard her use before. The old man was lying on the floor. He had tried to walk to his chair by himself and had fallen, and by the time Marin reached him, his chest was no longer moving. She pulled him away from the foot of the table, laid him flat on his back, tilted his head, and began compressions. The housekeeper called for an ambulance. They said 30 minutes. In that weather, in that neighborhood, 30 minutes meant too late, and everyone in the room knew it. "Count for me," Marin said. Elias knelt on the other side of the old man and counted. He counted aloud, evenly, neither fast nor slow, and whenever she began to tire, he raised his voice slightly to hold the rhythm for her. She pressed down. She changed hands. She drove her entire weight through both straightened arms, sweat running into her eyes while outside the windows the wind struck the walls of the house in heavy waves. After a while, she told him to change places with her, and he obeyed. She placed her hands over his to correct their position, and he performed the compressions while she checked. Then she took over again. Twice she stopped to listen. Both times she told him to continue. The wall clock in the next room kept ticking, and no one looked at it. Sometime after the 20th minute, the old man gave a dry cough and his chest rose. The ambulance arrived 11 minutes later. Salvatore Ferrante lived for another 11 days. He wasn't lucid often, and when he was, he didn't remember what had happened in the sitting room, and no one told him. Elias went down to Amherst every day during those 11 days. He arrived in the afternoon, sat in the chair beside the window, and didn't say much. Some days he read the sports pages aloud to the old man. Some days he simply sat there while he slept. On the 9th day, while Marin stood at the kitchen sink and Elias sat beside the bed, the old man opened his eyes and looked at him for a very long time. He lifted one hand from the blanket, searching through the air, and Elias reached out to take it. The old man held on tightly. "You came home," he said. Elias didn't move. "I knew you would come home," the old man said. "I kept telling your mother. I told her you'd come back. You always would." The man whose name the entire city of Buffalo was afraid to speak over dinner sat beside that bed with the old man's hand held in his own, and he lowered his head slightly. "Yes," he said. "I'm home, Dad." The old man died on the morning of the 12th day, just as the sky began to brighten, and the maple tree outside the window was showing its first new buds. He passed in his sleep, without pain, with one hand resting on top of the blanket. On the mantel in the sitting room, his daughter's wedding photograph remained exactly where it had always stood, the beautiful young woman beneath an arch of flowers wearing the smile of someone who knew with absolute certainty that she was beautiful, and until his final breath, he still believed she had been a good daughter. Cyrus Corsaro arrived one afternoon in early April in the black car with a driver, and he brought Camille Ferrante with him because she very much wanted to see her younger sister's house again. She stepped out wearing black clothes she had continued to wear far beyond the time mourning aloud, looked up at the front of the house, and raised a tissue to her eyes before both feet had even touched the gravel. They took tea in the large drawing room. It was the large drawing room because Marin had asked for it to be, and the doors at the far end had been left open because she had asked for that as well. And in the corner beside the bookcase sat a small man with thick glasses and a pullover sweater worn thin at the elbows. reading a fishing magazine, though no one introduced him or explained who he was. Cyrus Corsaro waited until the second cup of tea before coming to the point, because he had been raised far too well to hurry. He said he would speak plainly because this was a family matter. He said there had been talk, that there had been talk for many years, and that he had always defended his cousin against it. He said health wasn't something to be taken lightly, that the family needed a strong and healthy man at its head, and that perhaps the time had come to discuss retirement. Elias set down his teacup. Marin stood before he could speak. She switched on the small projector resting on the side table, and on the white wall behind Camille Ferrante appeared an enlarged expense record taken from the family accounts, every line sharp and clear. "Sir, with your permission, I'd like to ask Miss Ferrante a question about rental payments." Camille Ferrante stopped dabbing at her eyes. "What are you asking me?" "The property at 411 Grant Avenue. You're listed as the owner, and a company belonging to this family is listed as the tenant under a long-term lease." Marin didn't raise her voice, and she looked at no one but the wall. The original rent was $4,000 a month. That was ordinary. No one in this room questions it. She moved to the next page. "This is the first increase, $9,000. Mr. Corsaro approved it in his capacity as property manager while his cousin was away." Another page. "This is the second increase, $15,000. The same signature." She turned to the right-hand column. "Miss Ruth Pryor has kept the visitor logs and telephone records for this house for 34 consecutive years. The records show the exact weeks when calls began going to the mothers of women employed here. The first wave came 5 days after the first rent increase. The second came 9 days after the second increase. The third came 6 days after the final increase." She lowered her hand. "I can't prove why one person does something. I can only place before you the date he did it and the date it became useful to him, then let the room do the arithmetic." "This is a servant reading an expense ledger," Cyrus Corsaro said, and some of the warmth had left his voice. "This is nothing. These are dates," Marin said. "Would you like me to read them again more slowly? Because a doctor sitting directly behind you has written every one of them in his notebook during the past 2 minutes. Cyrus Corsaro turned around. The small man with thick glasses touched the tip of his pencil to his tongue. "Warren Halloway," he said cheerfully. "Trauma surgery, 31 years. Here and in Cleveland. I performed a complete physical examination on Elias Corsaro in the spring of the year his wife went to Italy, at his own request. I found a perfectly normal man. I told him so. I told his wife's private physician the same thing. And for the past 4 years, I've said the same to anyone courteous enough to ask me." He looked up over the rims of his glasses. 4 years. Not one person repeating that story ever thought to ask the only man in this state who could answer the question. Don't you find that strange? Camille Ferrante sprang to her feet, and the chair behind her fell onto the wooden floor. The tissue slipped from her hand. "You told me it was rent money," she said. "Cyrus, you told me it was rent money." Cyrus Corsaro didn't look at his sister-in-law standing beside the fallen chair. He set down his teacup, opened the leather briefcase at his feet, and took out a stapled packet of papers he had brought with him from the beginning and hadn't needed until now. He placed it on the low table in the middle of the room and turned it so everyone could see. "Miss Vogel is very good at reading dates," he said. "I can read a few myself." It was a notarized statement from a man named Dale Brenner, the union representative at the hospital where Marin had once worked the night shift, the man who had sat in the meeting room that day on the same side of the table as she had. He laid out the entire story, the date, the amount, $42,000 in exchange for a signature on a non-disclosure agreement, in exchange for withdrawing a complaint, in exchange for silence about a surgeon who had entered an operating room while impaired. And the date of the signature, written clearly on the page, fell in the very month her mother began her final course of chemotherapy. Elias Corsaro hadn't known. Marin saw it on his face before he had time to hide it. The entire room looked at her. "You stand here lecturing us about truth," Cyrus Corsaro said, and the warmth returned to his voice, calm and reassuring, the voice of a man helping someone in need. "You already sold it once, Miss Vogel. I'm simply offering more than that hospital did." Marin didn't look down at the papers. She didn't look at Elias. She remained where she was beside the projector, both hands resting at her sides. "Yes," she said. "I signed it." No one spoke. "My mother had 4 months left," she said. "The doctor gave me that number on a Tuesday morning, and I sat in my car in the parking lot and calculated. 4 months of medication, 4 months of someone coming to the house every day. 4 months in her own home instead of in a room with 12 beds. I counted how much it would cost, and I didn't have the money. Then they put that paper in front of me. Her voice remained as flat as it had been while she read the expense records. I signed it on Thursday afternoon. I bought my mother those 4 months, and she died in her own home, in her own room, with me sitting beside her. That surgeon kept his license, and I've lived with what I did every day from then until now. She looked at Cyrus Corsaro for the first time. But you've just done something very foolish, sir. He didn't answer. You've just proved to everyone in this room exactly what I needed them to see, she said. People sign papers like that when they have nowhere else to turn. That's the only time they sign. You picked up my paper and held it out for everyone to see, and you didn't realize you were also holding up the reason I signed it. She picked up the projector remote and switched it off. The wall returned to blank white. And now I do have another way. Cyrus Corsaro stood. He buttoned his coat slowly, picked up his leather briefcase, and walked toward the door. At the doorway, he stopped and turned. There was no warmth left in his face now, nothing of the man who had just taken tea in a beautiful room. Your brother owes $87,400, he said. I hold every document. You say one word about what happened this afternoon outside this room, and before Christmas he'll be sitting in state prison, and you'll be the one who put him there. Elias Corsaro rose from his chair. Sit down, Marin said without turning around. Please. He remained standing for 1 beat. Then he sat. Sir, Marin said, my brother is a fool. He has been a fool since he was 19 years old, and I've paid for that foolishness every year of my life. $87,400. She nodded slowly. I earn $54,000 a year. If I live carefully, I can repay you in 7 years. And I will live carefully, because I've never known any other way to live. She continued in the same voice. You could erase it this afternoon. I know the price. You want me to sign a paper saying I crawled into the bed of a broken man and made myself mistress of this house. She didn't raise her voice once. I would rather watch my brother go to prison, and if he understood what he was signing, he would choose the same thing. But he has never understood, and he never will. She picked up the packet from the low table and placed it in his hands. Go home. You won't put him in prison. The day you do, everyone will ask why a man like you went to so much trouble over $87,000. Then someone will look at the dates. The meeting took place 9 days later, on the upper floor of an old Italian restaurant on Hertel Street, in the private room the 5 families had used for more than 60 years. A round table, 10 chairs, no telephones, no briefcases, and no one brought anything with them. That was the rule, and the rule had existed since the days of the fathers of the men now seated there. 4 old men arrived first and took their places. Cyrus Corsaro came with 2 men accompanying him, and they stood against the wall behind his chair with their hands clasped in front of their stomachs. Elias Corsaro arrived last, alone. He brought no one with him. He carried nothing at all. He pushed the door open with one hand, stepped inside, and crossed the middle of the room with that gait that leaned slightly to one side, slower than usual, because the wooden staircase outside was steep. For 4 years, the entire city had said that he was a broken man. If he walked through that door tonight, with a gun beneath his coat and 4 men at his back, then he would be exactly what they said he was. He carried nothing, and he walked to the empty chair on the opposite side of the table. One of the 2 men standing against the wall behind Cyrus Corsaro was the younger one, Petey Malloy's nephew, the nephew of the man whose hands had trembled at the dinner table the winter before. As Elias passed him, the young man pushed himself upright from the wall, pulled out the nearest chair, and stepped back. He did it before he had time to think. His body did it, not his mind. He realized what he had done about a second later, and his face went pale, and he retreated to his former place against the wall. No one in the room said anything about it, but Cyrus Corsaro saw. He saw it very clearly, and for a moment something passed across his face, and then disappeared. He spoke for 20 minutes. He spoke very well, clearly, and without raising his voice. And he talked about health, about stability, about a family needing to know who would stand where 10 years from now. He didn't mention the expense records, Grant Avenue, or his sister-in-law. The 4 old men listened. When he finished, 3 of them asked a few brief questions, and he answered each one neatly. The 4th man, the oldest of them, sat in the darkest part of the room and asked nothing. His name was Calloway. He was 81 years old, and he hadn't spoken a single word since entering the room. Now he placed both hands on the tabletop. 3 years ago, Mr. Calloway said, this young man came to my house. Everyone turned toward him. He sat in my kitchen and told me my nephew wasn't strong enough to hold that seat. He said it very skillfully. He said the same thing the entire city was saying at the time, and I had heard it so often that I mistook it for the truth. He raised his eyes to Elias. I believed him, and I was the one who told him to go ahead. No one moved. So today, I cast my vote, Mr. Calloway said, and I cast it against myself. He pushed his chair back and stood slowly, supporting himself with one hand on the table. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Corsaro. I'm only telling you this so that from now on, you never trust an old man who sits silently in a room. It lay at the bottom of the third bin beneath a layer of old file folders. And Marin found it on the final evening she spent sorting through those papers in the reading room. It was a small envelope with a date written on the label in pencil, and inside were 2 things. The first was a printed record of messages sent and received on the old phone during the final 2 years, complete with names, times, and every other detail. The second was a recording less than 4 minutes long, the voice of a woman speaking to her sister inside a car, without knowing she was being recorded, and within those 4 minutes was everything the entire city of Buffalo had spent the past 4 years telling incorrectly. Marin listened to it all. Then she listened a second time. She sat alone in that room for a long while, and when she finally stood, she understood exactly what she was holding in her hands. Give those 4 minutes to 3 people in the city, and before breakfast the next morning, the old story would be dead. It wouldn't merely fade or slowly lose its heat. It would die completely, cleanly, and people would be forced to retell it in the opposite direction for the rest of their lives. She carried the envelope downstairs. Elias was in the back courtyard beside the steel drum the gardener used for burning dry leaves, and there was a fire inside it because the nights were still cold in late spring. He took the envelope, opened it, and read the pages by the firelight. Then he lifted the small memory card and turned it between 2 fingers. He stood that way for a very long time, long enough for the flames in the drum to sink once, then flare again when another piece of wood caught. The girl has a father who has never met her, he said. He teaches piano to children. He's never done anything wrong to me, to her, or to anyone else. He doesn't even know he has a daughter. He was still looking at the memory card. If I release this, the entire city will know within a week. Then he'll know. Then 15 years from now, she'll type her mother's name into a computer, because every child eventually does that, and she'll read all of it. He turned to look at Marin. I don't have the right to do that to a child simply because I want people to stop laughing at me. He dropped the memory card into the drum. Then he fed the pages into the fire one by one, without haste, and the paper curled, caught, and burned in a bright golden glow that cast its light across both their faces. Marin stood beside him and didn't stop him. She didn't say anything. She remained there until the final page had burned away, and only red coals remained inside the drum, and the wind off the lake lifted the ashes into a thin gray trail that dissolved into the darkness above the trees. A few days later, on a May afternoon, Marin went down to the kitchen for some water and found Ruth Pryor sitting at the head of the table with her cloth-bound ledger and pencil, adding up the week's expenses, just as she had done for 34 years. A cup of tea had gone cold beside her. Marin sat down and, without quite knowing why, took from her coat pocket the note folded into quarters that she had kept since February and placed it on the table. Did you know about this? She said. The car, the rear window, the tires, everything. Ruth Pryor glanced at the note once, then finished adding the column of figures. It wasn't him, she said. It was me. Marin remained silent. He gave me some money at the end of January and told me to get you whatever you needed. That was all. He didn't specify what. Ruth Pryor drew a line beneath the column. I was the one who went out to the parking area and inspected the car. I was the one who called the mechanic down on Sheridan Road. I was the one who chose the tires, because you drive that road every Saturday, and I've been driving it for 34 years. She turned to a fresh page. He doesn't even know what was wrong with your car. He has never looked at your car once in his life. Marin stood to get a glass of water, and she remained at the sink with her back turned, opened the faucet, then shut it off again without filling a glass. She felt something inside her chest grow cold very quickly, so quickly that she was ashamed of it. As for the note, Ruth Pryor said without looking up, He wrote that. Marin turned around. I brought the whole package to him and asked him to write something on it so I could leave it on the driver's seat. I thought it would take him 3 seconds. She added another line of figures. He sat at that table for 40 minutes. I had to come back twice. There were several discarded pages in the wastebasket the next morning. I didn't read them. Beyond the kitchen window, the afternoon wind moved through the shrubs where the first new leaves had begun to appear. Miss Pryor, Marin said, why did you come to my apartment that day? Ruth Pryor finished the final column. She wrote the total in the corner of the page, checked it once, then set down her pencil. There were 211 applications, she said. They came through 3 different offices over more than a year. I read every one. More than 40 of those people were more skilled than you, and more than a dozen were far less expensive. She closed the ledger. I chose you because, out of those 211 people, you were the only one who had ever lost a job for saying something true. Marin couldn't speak. In this house, Ruth Pryor said, people can buy almost anything. They buy doctors, lawyers, people willing to put their names on property, even the sworn statement of a union representative. I didn't need a good nurse, Miss Vogel. I needed someone who couldn't be bought. She picked up the ledger and the cold cup of tea and stood. That's all, she said, then walked out of the kitchen. No one laid a hand on Cyrus Corsaro. The world he had spent his entire life climbing into had laws of its own, and those laws said that taking money from the common fund to purchase a story against the man at the head was something no one forgave, and the 5 families had voted. He lost everything within a single summer. He lived for many more years in another city, about 100 miles away, selling life insurance from an office with 3 desks. And by the time he died, hardly anyone in Buffalo still remembered his name. They married in September. No church, no 600 guests, no photographs in the newspaper. They married in the community room of the volunteer clinic in Black Rock. The room with the vinyl floor, several rows of folding chairs, and a bulletin board covered with notices about flu vaccinations. 60 people came. Most of them were patients from the clinic. The elderly woman with arthritis in her hands sat in the front row and cried through the entire ceremony. Warren Halloway stood beside the groom in a suit he had owned for 20 years, and he cursed the weather from beginning to end. He cursed the September wind in that city, cursed the road he had been forced to drive, and even cursed the folding chair he had to sit in. Every time he cursed, Elias laughed, and Marin realized that she had never heard him laugh so much in all the time she had known him. That morning, before they left, he told her he would erase Wesley's entire debt that day, call it a wedding gift, and consider the matter finished. Marin said no. She told him that if he paid it for Wesley, the boy would learn that whenever trouble came, someone else would pay for it, and he had believed exactly that for all 24 years of his life. Elias looked at her for a moment, then nodded, and he never brought it up again. Wesley Vogel repaid that debt by working the night shift at the family's concrete plant for 4.5 years, earning $19 an hour, exactly what everyone else earned, not 1 penny more. The process of withdrawing from the illegal parts of the business took 7 years. Elias did it piece by piece, slowly and carefully, because moving too quickly meant some people would lose their jobs and others would lose their lives. The Southern Harbor operation was sold. The transportation company was sold. The 3 restaurants on Elmwood were kept and placed on clean books from beginning to end. The concrete plant was kept, along with all 90 jobs. During those 7 years, 3 men who had once called him brother stopped calling him. One of them lived in Cleveland, a man who had stood beside him at his father's funeral. And when that man died one winter, Elias didn't attend the funeral because he knew he was no longer welcome there. He read the brief notice in the newspaper, folded the paper, and sat on the back porch for a long time that night. Marin brought him a cup of coffee and sat beside him on the steps. "Do you regret it?" she asked. He took the coffee and looked out toward the dark surface of the lake below. "No," he said, "but I don't pretend it cost me nothing." Wesley Vogel worked the night shift at the concrete plant for 4.5 years and repaid every last dollar, and throughout those 4.5 years, he never asked anyone for a thing. He became a shift supervisor in his 3rd year. He married in his 5th, to a 2nd-grade teacher from South Buffalo, and in his wedding speech he said that his sister had saved him by refusing to save him, and the entire room laughed because they thought it was a joke. Rourke Fallon moved away that autumn, and no one tried to stop him. Several years later, the Black Rock Clinic received a postcard from Montana. There was no message and no signature, Only a photograph of a stream and a man's arm holding a fishing rod, the right arm, whole and unharmed. Marin pinned it to the board beside the vaccination notices, and it remained there for many years. A woman in Cheektowaga received money in her bank account every month, regularly, until the day she died, and she never knew where it came from. She stopped working double shifts. Both of her children finished college. One became an engineer, the other worked at the city library, and neither of them ever knew. Their first child was born the following spring, a boy, and then came another boy, and then a daughter who was more difficult than both her brothers put together. Marin kept the family's books for 30 years, and she did it better than anyone who had ever done it before her. A clinic in Black Rock was rebuilt from the foundation up, with 8 examination rooms and a dental office, and the stone beside the main entrance bore a name that wasn't hers, because she wouldn't allow it, but her mother's, and Elias kept asking. He asked in the evenings while she sat at the table with her columns of figures, and through all the years, he never stopped asking the same question. "Are you happy?" Marin set down her pen. "Can you hear the fireplace?" He nodded. "All 3 children are asleep. This month's bills are paid. And this morning, a woman called the clinic asking for work because someone told her it was a decent place." She picked up her pen and returned to her column of numbers. "You ask me that every evening. You can stop when you finally listen to the answer. Perhaps what remains after everything isn't the question of who was right and who was wrong, but how we choose to treat a person after the entire world has already decided who that person is." That man held in his hands something that could have cleared his name in a single night, something he had waited 4 years to find, and he dropped it into the fire so that a child who had never done anything wrong would never have to read that story. And what about you? Would you burn it? Or would you tell the truth to reclaim your honor? Please share your honest thoughts in the comments. I read every line, and I truly want to know what this story touched inside you. And if it meant something to you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue bringing you new stories every day. I wish you good health, peaceful days, and a joyful life beside the people you love. Goodbye for now, and I'll see you again in the next video.